Now, sustainable growth is central to APEC's agenda, and this week's meetings aim to provide greater policy direction on balancing growth and quality of life. Now, as we've seen, there have been a number of natural disasters worldwide, such as the floods we saw in Spain and wildfires in the United States on both coasts. Do you think countries are moving fast enough and doing enough to address this issue?
Well, I think the short answer is no. Countries are not moving fast enough, and there's economic and socioeconomic reasons why that is. I mean, the answer directly is cutting emissions, primarily greenhouse gases. The focus has always been on carbon, but others such as methane are also popping up on the radar as a way to reduce this trajectory of warming. And by doing so, then you cut on these impacts that we've seen in recent times, of course, rising temperatures, these extreme weather events. But the tough point with that is a lot of economies around the world are based on fossil fuel development, right? And so untethering different economies from fossil fuel-based development and growth without sort of having a backup plan to sort of prop up the economy while they're phasing out fossil fuels is proving to be challenging. And I think that's one of the main reasons. There are certainly others that's making certain countries a little bit slow in terms of adopting the climate mitigation agenda.
Now, is this an issue of political will or just a kind of stalemate in terms of how this actually can be achieved so as to not, of course, hamper economic growth while, of course, staying focused on the importance of addressing climate change?
I think it's a kind of a combination of both, but the political will to act is also hindered by what that future will look like absent capability to shift to, say, renewable energy sources or even electrifying systems and grids in a way that still isn't dependent on fossil fuels or even natural gas. So I think the reluctance in some cases is because there isn't a good enough plan to substitute what those economies and systems are based on in terms of infrastructure and energy grids. I mean, it's easy to talk about shifting the consumers to say things like electric vehicles, but for a lot of countries, there's not enough infrastructure in place to support scaling up the use of EVs, as an example. So I think a lot of that is just based on there isn't a substitute or ramping up of a substitute in place to facilitate that transition much more easily.
So that's an important point you raised there about infrastructure, and of course there are costs to infrastructure development. Currently the UN COP29 talks are underway in Baku, and climate finance is of course a top issue. Calls have been growing for rich countries to spend more to help poor nations adapt and cope. Is this the right approach, do you think?
It is one of the approaches to pursue. It's certainly not one size fits all. There's multiple angles that should be addressed. Doing this track in terms of helping developing nations to become more climate resilient in terms of boosting their ability to access financing and funding resources is good. But I think it really, for example, I'll focus on the loss and damage fund. That's really what's been very popular in terms of the COP cycle over the last couple of years. But even that funding mechanism primarily looks at addressing imbalances of the past that have put those countries in a vulnerability position. Not much in terms of preparing for the future. Because as we're trying to deal with cutting emissions, we need to at least enable countries to adapt with the impacts of climate change as they happen, because the fix doesn't happen overnight. I mean, this is something in the scale of decades. So certainly propping up developing countries to be better prepared for climate change is one way, but also developed nations should try to push the agenda in terms of enabling their systems and infrastructure to become more climate resilient and propagate that change towards systems that aren't purely based on fossil fuels.
Mohammed Mahmoud, many thanks for your insights there.
Thank you.